Critical minerals have become both the new backbone and the Achilles heels of global manufacturing and advanced technologies. There is simply no manufacturing without them, and the decisions about whether factories keep running is increasingly being more made far from the shop floor. My guest today has spent his career understanding exactly how China built not just manufacturing supremacy, but a deliberate global chokehold on the minerals and mine streaming process that underpin everything from EVs to AI to defense systems and everyday plant operations. Tomasz Nadrowski is the author of Mineral War, China's Quest for Weapon and Mineral Destruction, a former vice president at the world's largest gold producer, and a portfolio manager focused on critical minerals. More than 9,000 mining investors and supply chain professors follow his weekly analysis because he brings both the financial and the ground level perspectives. In this conversation, we dig into why China's monopoly is so dangerous. It's not just about what's in the ground, but about the controlling the roundabouts, middle of the value chain, the refining, the magnets, the machine tools, and the processing capabilities that rest of the world now depends on. Tomasz walks through how Beijing has already weaponized this position with more than 24 export restrictions, what low-hanging solutions actually exist, and why the timeline for this new miners are simply too long for the urgencies we face. Most important, for the leaders listening, we explain how these mineral bottlenecks and shifting power dynamics will reshape the dynamic factory operations have to make over the next decade as we move deeper into the future of manufacturing. Tomasz Nadrowski, welcome to Factory of the Future podcast.
Welcome to Factory of the Future, people-powered health. Podcast focused on trends shaping the future of manufacturing. I'm Alexandria Burek, your host, here with A.W. Schultz, two thought leaders with a passion for people and manufacturing. Today and every episode, we are diving deep into the advancements, sustainable practices, and dynamic changes transforming how we produce everything.
And now welcome Alexandria Burek and A.W. Schultz.
Okay, so Thomas, you have to go into what drove you to write the book Mineral Wars, because it is absolutely one of my favorite. It is. I read it, and if you look at the amounts of highlights and imprints on it, it is something that I have never been a part of. And part of the future of manufacturing podcast is about manufacturing, but you tend to take away is that minerals are a big part of it. So if you can just kind of give me an explanation to, if you're telling somebody like why should they read this book if you're interested in manufacturing, maybe that's my segue into it. What are your thoughts?
Great question. There is no manufacturing without minerals. There never will be.
It does not exist.
Okay. The only things you can actually put into manufacturing is either something you actually dig from the ground and maybe grow, sometimes suck from the ground for hydrocarbons, but that's what it is. There's nothing else as the primary matter that you can bring there. And so mining and metals are an inherent part of that. But it is a mineral war for one reason. And the reason is that it just happens that some of these minerals are controlled by one source of supply. That in itself wouldn't be a problem. It happens sometimes because when God decided where geology is on this planet throughout its history, he didn't consult humans who decided to run borders and frontiers, and therefore some countries are more endowed than others geologically. And I worked in one of those, South Africa, a monopoly on platinum, for example. never really a problem, right? We use catalytic converters in ICE cars for decades. The problem starts when the monopoly begins to weaponize that position. And that's exactly where we are today. And that affects a number of minerals, and it's actually a misnomer. These are actually elements. So elements on the periodic table, some 30, 40 of those that become critical for three interrelated reasons. One is that they are potentially constraints on supply. The second one is that they are structurally vital for demand. Demand for infrastructure, communications, energy, and dual use, including military applications. And then the third element of this is that they are difficult to substitute because they have very unique features, very unique characteristics, chemical, physical, subatomic, and so on, that allow them to be combined either as components, as compounds, or as alloys into something that then you use in the manufacturing process. So there wouldn't be manufacturing without them. And the problem is that that decision, whether there will be or won't be, might these days be taken in Beijing and not in a factory where we work.
Yeah, and one of the things you bring up, I'm going to say the majority of your book is talking about how China is impacting a lot of these minerals. And could you give our audience a little bit input into, I mean, you don't see it on the news, but I'm going to say it's a lagging indicator that what is probably going to be happening in the near future, and what your book kind of brings to light.
Yeah, so very unfortunately, it has already happened. So it's not quite in the future. The first time China actually tried to weaponize this sector was in 2010. We didn't pay any attention because it only affected Japan back then. Since 2020, roughly, since the new law that was promulgated in Beijing, it's called Export Control Law, China introduced a lot of restrictions. By my count, 24 different restrictions affecting various of these minerals, associated technology, processing technology, sometimes extraction technology as well. But there are essentially two sides to this coin. One is the access to the actual minerals in the ground. And for that, actually, China is pretty well endowed. When I mentioned about God's decision, one of God's decisions was Gondwana, a supercontinent that includes such metal ore-bearing continents today as Africa, Australia, and South America, par excellence mining areas, right? Very well known for producing some of the larger minerals, such as copper, iron ore, and so on. Well, part of China belongs to the same geological history. It's called Yangtze Craton in the south. They have a lot of critical minerals starting from tin and tungsten, antimony, rare earths, and many others. But it's part of a story, and some of these minerals are not present in China, and therefore China went out, say, to Africa, South America, looking for those and controlling that pipeline vertically back to the Chinese smelting and refining sector. Now, why is that so important to understand? So there was this economist, Austrian economist, Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. He was also a finance minister for a while in Austria-Hungary, and it's an important voice in the theory of roundaboutedness. What are roundabout goods? Roundabout goods are capital goods in the middle of the supply chain, so intermediate products. And so if you have one country that controls today machine tools, refining equipment, coating equipment, magnets, capacitors, inverters, track laying machinery, robotic arms, and so on. That is exactly what's in the middle of the value chain. And without this, there is no manufacturing downstream. So roundaboutedness means that you don't go out there to the river and catch the eel with your hands, which would be, potentially instantaneous gratification if you're lucky. It means actually going back and trying to weave a net. It's going to take time. So it takes time and resources to build that middle of the value chain. But once you have it and you control a significant capacity there, and in Chinese case, it's overcapacity because the local demand is so deficient, then you can weld the entire global manufacturing process to that capacity. And minerals, mineral inputs, and mineral processing are an integral part of that system. And that's the most dangerous part of that monopoly, because it will take years for us to rebuild that capacity.
I'm sorry, you said deficient. What?
Deficient demand. So the Chinese economic model is very Marxist. So it's based on productive forces. So labor theory of value. This is what Friedrich Engels suggested in the 19th century. And very few Western economies continue to believe in that. We believe that the driver of economic growth is demand, right? And just the question, what kind of demand? Is it demand for just consumer goods or capital goods? Is it demand from the current savings, as Keynes said, or if it's from long-term resources, that depends, but it's always demand. Why is that? Because we believe that value is created at the moment of exchange, of a transaction, and then that value can be understood upstream into the consumer product and the capital goods, this roundabout goods, right? And then eventually materials and resources and economic factors. So land, value of land, capital, and labor. So that's the movement. Marxists don't believe this. So Communist China doesn't believe it. They believe that by infusing economic factors into the productive process and then resources such as critical minerals to it, that they created value. Now, the question that I ask to them, okay, so what if you don't sell it? They don't care. They believe in Say's law. So I think 17th century Say's law. It's like, as long as you produce supply, there will be a demand. There is no demand in the PRC itself. So the demand, the consumption, domestic consumption was low already before COVID. And in this decade, 2020s, is running under, so below the trajectory that normally the trend would show us until 2019. Very, very weak domestic consumption. So you have overcapacity in everything, in solar, in batteries, in EVs, and so on. All of this floating outside to the external markets, creating the trade tensions with the United States, with European Union, with Japan and others. And of course, those countries, to protect their own industrial middle class and their democratic systems, want to push back against that. But it's impossible to push it back against that if the other facet of Chinese strategy is to weld the middle of the value chains to their roundabout capital goods, right? And so this is where, for example, when U.S. was trying to rebalance the lopsided trade relationship with China last year in 2025 on two occasions, well, China pushed back saying, well, in this case, you won't get any magnets, rare earth magnets, so something that's very vital, critical mineral-based product. And, within several weeks, the U.S. wouldn't be able to produce any cars. So it's a significant bottleneck, and it's a very conscientious long-term strategy to create that bottleneck, that choke point. And it's extremely difficult, for example, for European Union to run its own coercive package of policies to defend themselves against this predatory mercantilism, because every time they try, China says, well, in this case, no legacy chips for your car makers, right? Or no rare earths, or no tungsten for Japan, for example, which affects, of course, semiconductor production downstream. So it is a bigger story, but critical minerals are a key central part of that.
Yeah. That's a lot to digest, and it's very interesting. Where do you think, so the U.S. market is going to alter? Where do you think some of the options that we would see? Just a quick break, and then we'll get right back to the show. We are always open for meaningful sponsorship or guests that align with our audience. If your brand fits and would like to be on one of the top 10% podcasts in the world, let's chat. Reach out by email in the show notes. Back to the show.
Yeah, so we have to look for what I call low-hanging fruits, so something that doesn't have timelines stretching over decades. Unfortunately, in mining, they often do, or at least a decade and a half. So from the first discovery, so you find some mineralization, then you define what the resources are, so measured and indicated resources, as we call it, then you convert it into reserves. These are resources that are economically viable. And then from then on, you can have a final investment decision, do financing for this, and start building, with a project capital expenditure, bring an EPC or EPCM firm, and you start building it. And after, say 2 years of build out, you can start producing, you ramp it up to normal commercial level production. That, for a large mine, somewhere between 12 and 16 years. We don't have time for that. We don't have time because we're not in charge of the calendar. China showed that they're in charge of the calendar. So they can just switch off our productive capacity in many sectors just like that. And so we have to find solutions sooner. And those solutions, there are some are a little more experimental. Recently, there were two deals that the Department of Energy's, one of the departments, offered $134 million for Colorado School of Mines to work on extraction of critical minerals from red mud. This is a residue of bauxite alumina production, of which there are residues in different places. Another company called Phoenix Tailings will be looking at tailings, so the residue of past mining production that can contain different minerals, rare earths, niobium, and so on. And so technologically, there are some ways to accelerate it. A very important investment done by a Korean company called Korea Zinc, which will refurbish a struggling smelter in Tennessee, not just for zinc, but for a whole plethora of different byproducts. So many of these minerals are not mined directly as a primary product, but come as byproducts and have to be extracted during this process of smelting and refining. This is what Korea Zinc will do for indium, gallium, germanium, and several others. And of course, partnerships with countries that maybe were not as aggressive deindustrializing as we were, especially during the first, say, 8 years of this century, and so they have kept some industrial capacity. Of course, these are our three allies in Northeast Asia: Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. But there are bits and pieces of excellence still left in other countries that are allies. Upstream, it's of course Australia and Canada. Midstream, partly France, surprisingly, and of course Japan as well. So there are ways to do this. We wouldn't be able to pull it off by ourselves. We have an antiquated permitting system. We have a court system that blocks a lot of projects very easily, not just in this industry but across the board. And the permitting reform. How long have we been waiting? 20 months now, since Joe Manchin had that proposal in late 24. So there are sort of political hurdles here. There are technological hurdles. There are human capital hurdles. We do not necessarily have all the people to actually bring it up to scale. So we have to rely on international cooperation. Luckily enough, the restrictions that China imposed over those, say, first half of the 2020s were not just directed at the United States or just at Japan. They were just across the board, affecting the entire developed world, and therefore the entire developed world has exactly the same problem as the United States. So there is willingness to cooperate.
So, I mean, there's a lot of knowledge you pull forward on what China's resources are. What does the U.S. I mean, U.S. has why is the U.S. not more interested in plumbing their minerals that we have, or what assets do we have?
Now, we do have assets. We have very good geology, by the way, not any worse than Australia. This is not a problem really of geological resources. I think the gap, first here's the ideological gap that's not on our side so much. I mean, yes, we have the NIMBY problem, and of course the negative externalities. Nobody wants to live next to a mine. Australia is a little luckier in Canada because most of the population is concentrated, in Australian case, around the coast. In Canada, is mostly along the border of the United States. So you have a lot of free space where geology is very interesting, easier access. Now, once it's really inhabited, with private landowners or federal lands that have different rules, it's complicated. But if you look at why has China been so much ahead of everybody else? Not because it's some kind of mining geniuses. No, I mean, mining industry generally, until at least the great financial crisis, was controlled by a bunch of Anglo-Saxon companies, many of them listed in London or Sydney, Australia, or Toronto, to a lesser extent in the United States, but with a long legacy. Essentially an Anglo-Saxon industry dominated, right? Some French companies, of course, some Soviets and so on, but predominantly Anglo-Saxon. The problem is not there. The problem is in the middle. That obsession about metals, because metals means large production. Large production means a lot of control over both the civilian sector and most importantly, military sector. Because what's the role of military in a dictatorship? Protecting the regime. That's explicit in China. People's Liberation Army is not there to protect the state, is to protect the regime. It belongs to the Chinese Communist Party, not the state. And so you have to provide all of this hardware. This is an obsession that didn't start with Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong's biggest hero was Joseph Stalin. What was Joseph Stalin's real name? Djugashvili. He was Georgian. He changed his name to Stalin, meaning man of steel, or made of steel. The real concept is there. If you look at Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Xi Jinping, and so on, they're obsessed about metals. There is an obsession there, and of course, it's moving with technologies because there's a complexification of the processing. And I explained this in the book how different is, for example, the military hardware today and in the First World War. Like in the First World War, the Kaiser needed about 7 of them, and they still needed to go to the British Empire and obtain it somewhere from there, right? Today, we're talking about 70 different elements that go into the missiles that we're expanding now in the Middle East and so on. So it's more complex process, but the contrast is on both sides. It's the contrast of negligence, policymaking negligence in the United States and in the West in general. Europe didn't do a much better job either. I'd say even worse. And then the capital markets negligence. So the capital market that basically look for labor arbitrage or arbitrage for negative externalities. And then on the other end, you have this obsession about controlling that space, whatever the costs, whatever the environmental costs, whatever the labor costs. And of course, they offered for what the Chinese Communist Party considers strategic, cheap land, cheap labor, cheap capital, which is of primary importance because it's capital heavy, capital intensive industry. So always capital below GDP levels and below inflation rates in China, hence the misallocation of capital on the broader basis and this massive over leverage of this economy today. But they created that productive behemoth, right? And then you add to the subsidies and weak currency, and voila, here you have the behemoth.
Oh, wow, that's a lot to digest. What projects are you working on right now?
Oh, I love this question because few people ask me. Quite a lot. Looking at the tungsten project, private tungsten project in South Korea. There's been one successful restart of a former Japanese mine, during the time when Korea was a Japanese colony. That has been very successful, run by a Americanized Canadian company. There's another one like this run by Korean investors, so we're involved in that. We're involved in a very interesting antimony project in North Macedonia, also private, backed by some very well-known investors and mining professionals. These are the low-hanging fruits. So you have a past operation, sometimes underground, which ceased to function, say, in the 1980s, where the prices of commodities were generally low. Everything, right? The prices of oil were low. That was the agreement between Saudi Arabia and US to just crush the margins of the Soviet Union. But then generally commodities were weak, and when inflation came under control and then continued to weaken through the 1990s as the former Soviet Union flooded the market with the inventory. So a lot of these mines in Europe, in North America, in East Asia just shut down. Now, however, with the prices of these materials outside of China, because they are not easily available, because China wouldn't let you have it, they just slapped a complete embargo on tungsten for Japan. Now the prices have gone up. At these prices, many of these projects are viable. They actually economically make sense. So we're looking for those. And restarts are often easier than something that could be potentially metallurgically complicated. So there are a lot of processes that are being proposed from a lab level to pilot plant to demo plant on the way of commercialization, just to simplify the processing, simplify the refining, where we are kind of dependent on Chinese equipment and often Chinese reagents. That has to change. But the experimental stuff is somewhat frowned upon by the market, interestingly enough. So I haven't seen any success yet in terms of bringing completely new processing system that would accelerate our sort of rebirth of this industry in the West. And here it is, the investors, all say, hooray, we solved the problem. No, it hasn't happened yet. So it's more like sort of the typical route, but maybe finding something that's either right where the former mine is, or right around what we call brownfields development, it's much easier than just going into a greenfield spot and start drilling an area. It's, that still could be successful, but it's going to be beyond the horizon of investors at these interest rates.
I'm sorry, did you say the word brownfield? I didn't.
Brownfield. So there are two ways. So greenfields exploration is when you go, say, you have some kind of a map or some kind of an idea that maybe there is mineralization there, and you do greenfields exploration in the middle of nowhere. Brownfields is because there's already an operation, a historical operation, and maybe that operation, that particular vein or that particular porphyry or something has been extracted. But if you look at the broader geological setting, there are some indications that on a strike, as we say, or at depth or somewhere, there is more mineralization that could be turned into resources. So you drill there. And that's actually easier job than finding something in the middle of nowhere. So that's brownfields.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You have to take me to school on this stuff because it's new terms for me. I think it's a great introduction to what is the podcast is around is in manufacturing, and it's an introduction to where the future holds. Any last messages that you would like to bring to our audience?
Yeah, so anybody who's interested in manufacturing, I do recommend the book because I really focus quite a lot on what that means for the productive process, right? This is not a book about geology, really. So it's written by someone who's coming from the upstream, but the way we invest these days, we don't invest just looking at those drill holes. We invest by looking, how does this fit with the entire value chain rejuvenation, right? So it has to fit downstream. And we wouldn't invest in someone who has not figured it out strategically. So that's why I think for people interested in manufacturing, it's an important piece of the puzzle because there's so much work to actually, rebuild some of the basic industries on this side of the divide. We didn't choose this struggle. This was chosen, many years ago by the CCP to hide behind the Great Wall. They benefited from our capital. They benefited from our technology for a long time. But in 2013, Xi Jinping published his document number 9. I invite you to Google it, document number 9 by Xi Jinping, where you'll find that,
okay.
Yeah, he defined us as their enemy. Us, the West, Western institutions, Western values as an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. Once someone defines that he's your enemy, no matter what you think, it's a conflict. You cannot wish that away because a conflict is not a first-person experience. It really is a second-person experience. I might think that I'm your friend, but if you decided that it's not true, then we are not friends, right? So that's unfortunately how it works, by negative consolidation. That's how conflicts function. And we are in a conflict, or as I call it, mineral war.
Okay, yeah. And mineral wars, you buy it, Amazon, anywhere else. It's a great book. I read it, and it's I highly recommend it just to bring yourself up to knowledge on the economics of what is going on with the ideas of minerals into it, and it really opened my eyes to it, and I highly recommend it. And your book, it was well written. I've got references to it, and it's going up on my bookshelf. So I thank you for being on our podcast. And this is Factory of the Future, and we are out of here like finished goods. Stay tuned for our next episode of Factory of the Future, where we're exploring groundbreaking techniques and behaviors that are reshaping industrial landscapes. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review and help others discover the cutting-edge insights transforming manufacturing as we know it.